Hey everybody, it's Uncle John, and we're about ready to head back to the old homestead as we read two more chapters from The Bluebirds and Their Neighbors by author Neil Wayne Northey. We're almost to the end of the book. We're at chapter 27, and we'll dive right into it. Chapter 27 is named The Bluebirds Move to the Mountains. The Bluebirds were not at all like Mr. and Mrs. Cowbird. I should say not. They not only raised one family of babies, but after the first family had left the nest, they raised another. Mr. Bluebird had watched over the first family until they were entirely grown, while Mrs. Bluebird was sitting on the new eggs. After the new eggs hatched, it kept both Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird busy feeding the second family of babies until they were large enough to leave the nest. Before long, the second family was ready to leave the nesting box and join the first family. Of course, they were not so strong as the first family of young birds, but they were quite able to go with them from place to place on the old homestead. Everything was new to them and interesting. Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird had worked hard raising their two families, and they needed rest. "Let us move to the big mountains where it is cooler," suggested Mr. Bluebird one hot fall day. Said Mrs. Bluebird, "That's a good idea, a very good idea." So they left the old homestead and went to the higher and cooler atmosphere. It was almost a day's flight from the old homestead to the big mountains, and there were many things to be seen. Mr. Bluebird knew that before long they would be leaving for the sunny Southland, and he thought that the flight to the big mountains would strengthen the young bluebird's wings. Of course, the bluebirds did not fly straight to the big mountains without a rest. Oh no, they stopped quite often, for the young bluebirds got hungry. Whenever Mr. Bluebird saw a place that looked as if bugs would be plentiful, he stopped long enough for the young bluebirds to catch some. Once he saw a patch of wild berries, and that was a wonderful feast for all of them. It was quite a task for Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird to keep their family together along the way. First, Betty Bluebird would see something new that she wanted to investigate. Then one of her brothers would want to stop to rest and look around. Soon another would see a grasshopper or bug and stop to catch and eat it. And so it went throughout the long day. Then there were enemies to be watched. It kept Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird busy looking for hawks and warning the young bluebirds. You see, whenever the young bluebirds became hungry, they were so interested in catching bugs that they really were careless about watching for enemies. During the day, the bluebirds met another family of bluebirds that were also going to the big mountains for a vacation. They had been living on a farm not far from the old homestead. "Let's travel together," said Mr. Bluebird. Mr. Bluebird thought it would be safer not so lonesome if they joined their neighbors. The other bluebirds thought so too, and soon they were all flying together like one big family. It would be well if everyone would live together in peace on this earth as the bluebirds do. But some people are like Flash the hummingbird. Flash is selfish and prefers to live alone. He does not even live peaceably among other hummingbirds. If one comes near his flower, he darts at the intruder with his long, sharp bill and drives it away. He will not let other birds come near his garden. The bluebirds were glad to travel with the other bluebirds because they liked the company. They were not selfish. They did not care if the others caught some of the grasshoppers and bugs along the way. So when the two families arrived in the big mountains, they were having a fine time together. They were having such a nice time that Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird did not notice that Betty Bluebird was not with them until they were ready to go to sleep that night. "Where is Betty?" asked Mrs. Bluebird. Mr. Bluebird flew back and forth among the trees, but Betty was nowhere in sight. He visited their neighbors, but she was not with them. Mr. Bluebird was worried when he flew back to Mrs. Bluebird. "I cannot find Betty," he said. "She is not here." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Bluebird. "I hope she is safe. I wonder what could have happened to her." The long shadows were creeping through the trees and across the deep gorges in the big mountains. Soon everything was hidden in darkness. The Bluebirds had found a great pine tree, and there they had gone to sleep among its dense branches, wondering what had happened to Betty. Chapter 28. The Adventures of Betty Bluebird. Betty Bluebird had been enjoying her trip to the mountains. At first, everything had seemed new and strange to her. She was not quite sure that she was as safe as she had been at the old homestead, but after she had traveled a while, she began to lose her fears. She felt quite able to take care of herself. It was not long until Betty was flying bravely here and there, barely keeping in sight of the other bluebirds. Sometimes she would fly ahead while they were resting, and then she would stop and catch bugs until they came up to her. Sometimes she would stop with the others, and if she was not quite ready to go on when they did, she would wait and catch another grasshopper or other bug. Once, Betty stopped with the others. She had been flying a long time, and she was getting tired and hungry. When the rest left, Betty was busy trying to catch a large grasshopper. It was a flying grasshopper, and every time Betty was ready to grab it, it would fly again. At last, Betty saw another grasshopper sitting on the ground. She thought that she might grab it before it saw her, so she let the first one go, while she dashed after the next. Before Mr. Grasshopper knew Betty was near, she had grabbed him by the back, and that was the end of Mr. Grasshopper. When Betty was ready to fly again, she saw that she was alone. There was not another bluebird in sight. Everyone had gone on, and there was Betty in a strange land, hardly knowing which way to go. Betty remembered that she had last seen the other bluebirds flying across a field almost at the edge of the big mountains. Even though she flew as swiftly as she could, she did not overtake them. Up and up she flew in the big mountains, not knowing which way to go. Then Betty knew that she was lost. It was a lonesome Betty that sat on a limb of an aspen tree, wondering what to do. Then she noticed a tiny stranger sitting not far away. He wore a black cap and a white vest and looked quite pert in his bluish-gray overcoat and large black necktie. "Who are you?" said Betty, rather rudely, for she had never seen anyone like the stranger on the old homestead. "Chickadee-dee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee," he repeated in his sauciest air. Dandy the chickadee lived in the mountains most of the time, and that was why Betty had never seen him. He spent the greater part of his time looking for tree borers and bark lice among the trees, and he was as likely to hang from the bottom side of a twig as he was to sit on top of it. Dandy the chickadee was a relative of Whitebreast the nuthatch, and Whitebreast can stand on the side of a tree as well with his head down as with it up. It really makes no difference to him which end is up when he is looking for tree borers. Dandy the chickadee is not quite as active as Whitebreast the nuthatch, but he's not far behind. Neither of them would ever starve. "I wonder if you could tell me where I could find the other bluebirds," said Betty. "I am lost. I do not know where to go or where they went." But all Dandy would say was, "Chickadee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee." He must be proud of his name to say it over and over so many times. At last Betty flew farther into the big mountains and left Dandy the chickadee sitting there shouting his name after her. It was growing dark, and Betty feared that she would not find the others. Far ahead in the big mountains, Betty saw a hidden pasture. It was something like the wide, wide pasture on the old homestead, except that it was smaller and surrounded by trees. In it, Betty could see something that looked like old bent horn, but it was taller, and its horns were many, many times larger. It was the first time that Betty had ever seen Service the elk. Service the elk had come to the hidden pasture for his supper. During the day he had stayed hidden in the dense trees so Terror the hunter could not find him. The trees also helped Service to brush off biting fly. You see, Service did not have a long tail like old bent horns with which to switch off biting fly. His tail is only an abbreviation. It looked as if part of it was gone. So Service the elk was glad to hide in the dense trees where he could brush biting fly off his back. Betty was not so sure whether Service was a friend or not, but she thought that she would be safe if she sat on a high limb and asked Service about her family. Service had not seen her family because he had been hidden all day. He would not have noticed one bluebird more than another if he had seen them, for there were many other bluebirds in the big mountains. Betty Bluebird did not like to be alone, but there was nothing else to do. The long shadows were growing longer every minute. Betty almost wished she was back at the nesting box on the old homestead. As the laughing yellow sun bowed good night over a big mountain, Betty went to bed. She found a dense tree with broad, sheltering boughs, and there she went to sleep, about the same time that the bluebirds were going to bed in their great pine tree. But Betty had no idea where they were. And that's the end of chapter 28. Come back tomorrow, and Aunt Nikki will have the final 2 chapters of the Bluebirds and Their Neighbors for you. Stay tuned back. We've already had some questions about the next book, and we're planning on that right now. And if you check back, you'll get to see it just about the same time as everybody else. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time with the Bluebirds and Their Neighbors. Bye-bye.